All right, welcome back. Today, we are diving into something huge, the origin story of the New Testament. We're going to pull back the curtain and see exactly how a handful of ancient writings grew into one of the most powerful and influential books the world has ever known. Let's get into it.
So let's start with the big question. Think about it. When you see a New Testament today, it's just one book. But that's not how it started. So how on earth did these specific stories and these particular letters get chosen out of so many others to become this single foundational text? And boom, right out of the gate, we get a total game changer. The idea of a single-bound book called the New Testament, that would have sounded completely bizarre to the very first Christians. You see, they weren't trying to write a sequel to the Hebrew Bible. They truly believed they were living in the final days of the world. And you know what? The clue is right there in the name. The word Bible comes from the Greek phrase ta biblia, and that doesn't mean the book. It means the books, plural. That's the key right there. The Bible isn't a single volume. It's a library, a whole collection of different works written by different people over a long, long time. So to figure out how these books were made, we have to go back to a time before the books even existed. We've got to put ourselves in the world of Jesus and his first followers, a world that ran on the spoken word. Yeah, in the first century, stories, teachings, sayings, all of it was passed from person to person, out loud. Memory was basically the hard drive of the ancient world. And here's the most important part. Those early followers were convinced Jesus was coming back any day now. So why bother writing everything down for future generations? They didn't think there were going to be many future generations. Okay, so if nobody was in a hurry to write things down, what changed? And more importantly, what were the very first Christian documents that ever got put to paper? I'm willing to bet the answer is not what you think it is. Seriously, take a second and guess. What would you say? Most people would jump straight to the Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. But that's not what the evidence shows us. And here it is. The first Christian writings we have weren't the life story of Jesus at all. They were letters from the Apostle Paul. Just look at this timeline. Paul is writing his letters all the way back here, literally decades before the Gospel of Mark, the very first one, was even written. These weren't scripture. They were mail, urgent, practical mail. This quote kind of gives you a feel for just how personal these things were. Paul is writing to real communities he started, trying to solve their problems, answer their questions, and fix their arguments. He wasn't sitting there thinking, I'm writing a masterpiece for the ages. He was thinking, I gotta get a letter to Thessalonica and sort this mess out fast. So, Paul's letters come first. We got it. But what about the Gospels? What about the actual stories of Jesus' life? After decades of just talking about it, what finally made people say, okay, we need to write this stuff down? Well, this is where we have to tackle a really common belief. A lot of people assume the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, like reporters on the scene. But most historians see it a bit differently. They see them more as theological portraits, written long after Jesus lived, by later generations of believers. The goal wasn't just to report facts, but to preserve and shape the story for a movement that was exploding in popularity, and realizing it was in it for the long haul. So why the famous names then? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? Well, back then, it was actually a common practice to attribute a work to a big, respected name from the past. It wasn't about forgery, it was a way of saying, this text is in the spirit of this great teacher. It gave the work instant authority and credibility. And we actually have physical proof of these writings. This date, around 125 CE, comes from the oldest surviving scrap of the New Testament ever found. It's a tiny little piece of papyrus, no bigger than a credit card, from the Gospel of John. Just a tangible, physical link stretching back almost 2,000 years. Wow. Okay, so we've got Paul's letters circulating, and the four Gospels are getting really popular. But don't think the story's over. Not even close. For the next few hundred years, the Christian world was flooded with texts, which led to the final, messy, critical stage, deciding which books were in and which books were out. And when I say flooded, I mean it. This was a wild time. It wasn't just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There were tons of others. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and each one told a different kind of story about Jesus, which, as you can imagine, led to some really fierce debates over which ones were the real deal. So what finally forced them to make a decision? Well, it was a perfect storm of three major pressures. First, persecution. Roman soldiers show up and say, "Hand over your sacred books." Suddenly, you have to decide which of these are you literally willing to die for. Second, internal arguments about belief, things called heresies. To settle these disputes, leaders had to agree on which texts were authoritative. And finally, you have politics. The Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity, and he wants a unified church to help him run a unified empire.
And that brings us to this year, 325 CE. This is a massive turning point. The Emperor Constantine calls together this huge meeting of bishops from all over the world. It's called the Council of Nicaea, and its job is to sort all of this out.
And we're not talking about a small committee meeting here. 217 bishops showed up from across the entire Roman Empire. Their mission? To hammer out a unified, official version of Christianity. And a huge part of that meant deciding which books that Christianity would be built on. And right after the council, Constantine himself makes a power move. He orders 50 brand new, deluxe copies of the Gospels to be made for the major churches in his new capital city, Constantinople. That single act, that imperial stamp of approval, was a massive boost for the four Gospels we know today, pushing them way above all the others.
But listen, this wasn't decided in a single vote one afternoon. We know from the historian Eusebius, who was actually there, that this was a long, drawn-out process. He talks about how church leaders had been sorting books for years into different piles. Books that were recognized by everyone, books that were disputed, and books that they rejected as just plain spurious or false. And this is what all that effort led to, the Codex Sinaiticus. It's one of the oldest, most complete Bibles on the planet, dating right back to that same 4th century era. It's the physical product of this incredible centuries-long journey from a spoken word to a final, curated library.
So if you take one thing away from this, let it be this. The New Testament wasn't just found or delivered one day fully formed. It was born. It grew up, piece by piece, from spoken stories to scattered letters to powerful narratives, until finally, after centuries of use and debate and politics, it was shaped into the collection we know today.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question, doesn't it? Knowing this messy, complicated, very human story behind the New Testament, how does that change how you or I might read and understand these incredibly powerful ancient writings today? That's something to think about. Thanks for joining me.